June 1944. The Red Army smashes into the Karelian Isthmus with the kind of firepower that usually ends small nations' wars in days, not weeks. Finland's lines crack, Viipuri falls, and the road system funnels everything, men, guns, tanks, into a tight corridor near Tali-Ihantala. On maps, it looks like a minor bend in the front. On the ground, it becomes a national survival problem measured in minutes. How fast reserves can arrive, how quickly artillery can be retasked, how many Soviet formations can be broken before they punch through to Finland's heartland. Because if that corridor collapses, there may be no second defensive line that matters. And the twist is this: the battle's real weapon isn't a tank or a bomber, it's timing. The story starts with a brutal strategic reality. By 1944, the Eastern Front has shifted. Leningrad is no longer under siege, Soviet forces are on the offensive, and Finland's position, tied to Germany since 1941, has become far more dangerous. The Soviet Vyborg, Petrozavodsk Offensive opens in June with a clear operational aim: drive Finland out of the war, remove a northern threat, and free Soviet resources for decisive operations elsewhere. The stakes for Finland are existential, but also political. A negotiated exit depends on proving the front cannot be simply rolled up. If the defense collapses quickly, Finland risks terms imposed without leverage. If the defense holds long enough to demonstrate staying power, the calculus changes. That is the strategic bet hanging over every tactical choice that follows. The Red Army hits first with mass, artillery, air strikes, armor, and coordinated assaults aimed at breaking prepared positions through sheer density of fire and follow-on exploitation. Finnish forces retreat through successive defensive lines on the Karelian Isthmus. These withdrawals are not just about terrain, they are about time. Every kilometer conceded buys hours to reposition artillery, evacuate supplies, and move units into the next line before Soviet spearheads arrive. But time cuts both ways. A fighting retreat risks turning into a rout if the rearward movement loses cohesion, communications break down, or the Soviet advance reaches key road junctions before Finnish reserves do. The battlefield here is a commander's nightmare: forests, lakes, narrow roads, limited lateral movement. A breakthrough doesn't just open a gap, it creates a funnel that can't be easily sealed. And that is why Tali-Ihantala matter. They sit inside the Viipuri, Kuparsari, Taipale defensive system, the VKT-line, Finland's last major prepared belt before the interior routes become dangerously exposed. The ground forces movement into predictable channels. That predictability becomes either a death sentence or an opportunity, depending on who controls the timing of fires. Finland's challenge is simple to state and hard to execute: stop mass with precision. The Finnish army is smaller in men, lighter in tanks, and cannot afford wasteful counterattacks. What it does have is a mature artillery system, practiced in rapid concentration of fire, with observers, communications, and fire direction methods designed to put shells where they matter, fast. That system becomes the backbone of the defense. Not because artillery alone wins battles, but because artillery can shape the rhythm. Slow assaults, isolate spearheads, punish assembly areas, and force Soviet armor to advance without infantry cover, or infantry to advance without armor. In a corridor where roads and clearings dictate routes, artillery becomes a lever. The Soviets push toward Tali with pressure that feels continuous. This is not a single dramatic charge, it is a grinding sequence: probing attacks, heavy bombardments, armored thrusts, renewed assaults after regrouping. The aim is to find the weak seam, widen it, and flood through. Finland's aim is the opposite: identify the main effort quickly, concentrate fire, and keep reserves ready for the moment the line is about to break. Here is the first open loop that will decide everything later. Finland must commit reserves at the exact right moment. Too early, and they get chewed up in Soviet preparatory fires. Too late, and the breach becomes unrecoverable. The battle becomes less about heroics and more about decision tempo: how quickly leadership can recognize the main blow and act. The early fighting around Tali shows how close the margins are. Finnish counterattacks attempt to restore positions and disrupt Soviet momentum, but every local success risks overextension. Soviet armor appears in numbers that can overwhelm fixed points if the defense cannot keep it channelized. Meanwhile, Finnish units rotate, exhausted, and often under pressure to hold ground that is tactically ugly but operationally vital. Air power enters as a force multiplier rather than a standalone solution. Finnish air assets are limited compared to Soviet strength, but they can strike moments of vulnerability, columns on roads, armored concentrations, supply nodes, especially when coordinated with artillery and ground movements. Crucially, German air elements also appear in this period, adding weight to specific strikes. The point is not air superiority in the broad sense. The point is targeted interruption, forcing Soviet units to attack piecemeal rather than in a clean, synchronized surge. And here's the twist. While the battle is remembered for enormous artillery fire, the real contest is over information. Whoever identifies the next Soviet push first gets to choose where the killing happens. That information comes from multiple places: frontline reports, observation, and signals intelligence. Intercepted communications and pattern recognition help Finnish commanders anticipate likely axes of advance and timing of renewed assaults. None of this is perfect. War rarely offers certainty. But it offers enough warning to prepare the one thing Finland cannot improvise at the last second: massed fire plans. As Soviet forces shift pressure from one sector to another, Finland's artillery works like a system, battalions and batteries coordinating to saturate small target areas in concentrated bursts. The effect is not just casualties. The effect is disorganization. Tanks halt, infantry go to ground, follow-on waves pile into the same constrained lanes, and the tempo breaks. When tempo breaks, the attacker loses the ability to exploit success. Yet the danger grows. Soviet commanders are not blindly repeating mistakes. They probe, adjust, and keep pushing. They attempt to overwhelm the defense with repeated hammer blows, betting that even a well-run artillery system will eventually run out of ammunition, communications will degrade, or reserves will be exhausted. This is where logistics silently tightens the noose. Finland is firing immense quantities of shells for a nation of its size. Ammunition supply, gun barrel wear, transport, and the vulnerability of routes all become limiting factors. A defense built on concentrated fires must ensure the guns keep talking, the shells keep arriving, and the network does not fracture under bombardment. At the same time, Soviet logistics and replacement flow are larger, but they are also under pressure. The Karelian Isthmus is not an easy place to supply a rapidly advancing army through damaged infrastructure, contested airspace, and bottlenecks. Attacking forces can move faster than their supply echelons, creating moments where spearheads are powerful but briefly brittle. Finland's leadership faces another strategic layer. The defense must hold long enough to influence diplomacy. This is not just a military line. It is bargaining leverage. Every day held changes the perceived cost-benefit for the Soviet high command. But to convert time into leverage, Finland must avoid catastrophic losses that would make later defense impossible. The battle is approaching its most dangerous phase, when both sides believe the next 24 hours can decide the war, and the map is too small to hide a mistake. As June turns into the end-of-month crisis, pressure peaks. The corridor near Ihantala becomes a focal point. Soviet formations mass for renewed efforts. Finnish commanders concentrate guns, adjust defensive dispositions, and prepare to commit reserves not to win, in a sweeping sense, but to prevent a rupture. This is where the battle becomes a test of operational triage. Not every position can be held. Some are held only long enough to delay. Some are abandoned to preserve units. Some are counterattacked because losing them would open a road junction that makes the rest irrelevant. The most perilous moments in defensive warfare are the ones that don't look dramatic on paper. A unit's communications cut, a gap opens between battalions, a road is jammed with retreating and advancing traffic, artillery observers lose line of sight in smoke and forest, reserves arrive late because a bridge is damaged. In a narrow front, any one of these can cascade. And now we reach the hinge that sets up Module 2. Finnish leadership prepares for the decisive rhythm. The moment Soviet forces mass, the guns must already be aligned, the target areas already plotted, the observers already in place, and the reserves positioned to strike the exhausted edge of an assault. The mini cliffhanger is this. On the worst day of the battle, Soviet forces come closest to breaking through, so close that Finland's defense depends on whether its artillery system can deliver one more perfectly timed concentration, and whether reserves can move fast enough under fire to seal the line before it unravels. By late June 1944, the Soviet offensive has driven Finland back onto the VKT-line. The fighting compresses into the Tali-Ihantala corridor, where roads and terrain make breakthroughs decisive. Finland is smaller, under relentless pressure, and relying on a mature artillery system plus carefully timed reserves. The stakes remain national survival and diplomatic leverage. Now the battle enters its critical phase, when repeated Soviet massed attacks either crack the corridor or get broken at the moment of commitment. The escalation is immediate. Soviet commanders intensify efforts, seeking the breakthrough that earlier assaults failed to produce. This phase is defined by cycles: Soviet artillery preparation, armored infantry thrusts into the corridor, local penetrations, Finnish countermoves, and rapid concentration of defensive fires to isolate and crush the leading elements before they can widen a gap. Rehook, here's the twist: this is not a story about holding every meter. It's about making Soviet mass collide with Finnish timing over and over until the offensive loses its shape. Finland's turning point decision is operational, not rhetorical. Concentrate artillery and reserves to shatter massed attacks at the exact moment they are most vulnerable, when units are packed into narrow approaches, when momentum forces them forward, and when command links are strained. This is the central mechanism of Tali-Ihantala. It is not one miracle barrage. It is a repeatable process. Identify the main axis, allow the attacker to commit into constrained lanes, then saturate those lanes and assembly areas with concentrated fire while reserves counterattack to restore coherence. The goal is not to annihilate the enemy. The goal is to prevent the one thing the attacker needs: a clean breakthrough with organized follow-through. Airstrikes contribute as punctuation marks that disrupt timing. When coordinated effectively, bombing and strafing can slow reinforcement movement, scatter formations, and increase the friction that makes assaults arrive out of sequence. In a battle decided by tempo, disruption is decisive. The Soviet side faces its own pressure. This offensive is not happening in a vacuum. The Red Army is managing multiple fronts and strategic priorities. A rapid victory over Finland would be useful, but not at unlimited cost. As casualties mount and breakthroughs fail to materialize, the value of continuing high-intensity assaults on this narrow front must be weighed against other demands. But that weighing does not happen instantly. Commanders often push hardest right before they stop, because admitting the failure of a plan is psychologically and institutionally difficult. That means Finland must survive the most intense thrusts first. The fighting around Ihantala becomes a study in concentrated destruction and defensive resilience. Soviet armor, forced into predictable approaches, becomes vulnerable to planned fires and layered defense. Infantry assaults, met by rapid artillery responses, struggle to maintain cohesion. Local penetrations occur, but the Finnish response aims to prevent them from becoming operational openings. Rehook, the corridor is now a pressure cooker. Every Soviet push must succeed quickly, because every stalled push becomes a target list. This is where Finland's disciplined defensive method pays off. Artillery concentrations do more than cause casualties. They disrupt command, break the sequencing of assaults, and force Soviet units to pause and regroup under observation. Those pauses are fatal to momentum. A breakthrough requires speed, speed requires coordination, coordination requires functioning communications and intact formations. The more the attacker is forced to stop and restart, the more the defender can reset the problem. And crucially, Finland's reserves are used with restraint. Reserves are not thrown in for one more try. They are used to restore line integrity at the moment it is about to fail, then pulled back before they become fixed targets. This is defensive economy, triage applied to manpower. As early July arrives, the pattern becomes clearer. Soviet attacks continue, but the chances of a decisive rupture diminish with each failed attempt. The battlefield has absorbed repeated massed thrusts without yielding the operational outcome the Soviet plan requires. Now the consequences begin to surface. If the Soviet offensive cannot break the VKT-line here, then the road to the Finnish heartland remains blocked. The prospect of forcing capitulation by military collapse grows weaker. Finland's ability to negotiate, while still precarious, improves. This is the payoff phase of the battle. The offensive stalls. Not because the Soviets stop being powerful, but because power applied into the wrong geometry, against a defense optimized for concentration and timing, loses its ability to create decisive results. Rehook, and the final twist is that the battle's victory is not a triumphant march forward. It is breathing room, just enough to change the political endgame. The aftermath matters because it reshapes choices. With the front stabilized and the worst danger of a sudden breakthrough reduced, Finland's leadership can pursue an exit from the war on terms better than unconditional collapse. The fighting on the Karelian Isthmus, alongside other defensive battles in the summer of 1944, contributes to a broader strategic picture. Finland has demonstrated that conquering it outright will be costly and uncertain. Tali-Ihantala also becomes a legacy story about how smaller forces can resist larger ones when they concentrate on decision speed, fire control, and terrain exploitation. It is a reminder that numbers do not act by themselves. Numbers require coordination. Coordination can be broken. And sometimes the battle is decided not by who has more, but by who can turn minutes into advantage. The campaign-level outcome is not an endless stalemate. The war continues, but the immediate threat of a decisive Soviet breakthrough in that sector has been blunted. That shift influences the path to the armistice later in 1944 and shapes Finland's post-war survival as an independent state. Tali-Ihantala was decided by a choice that looks almost boring on paper. Hold long enough to concentrate fires, then commit reserves only when the enemy is fully committed. If you had been making that call with the front collapsing and the roads jammed, what would you have prioritized first? Reserves, artillery ammunition, or air support? If you want more stories where a single decision changes an entire campaign, like the video, share it with a friend who loves military history, comment your take, subscribe, and turn on bell notifications.